You're up before dawn because you're hungry, and also because the rooster's been screaming since the stars were still out. You stir from your bed of straw, stretch your sore back, and shuffle toward the hearth. The fire is out again. You forgot to bank the coals, which means you'll be eating your breakfast cold or waiting an hour to get anything warm. Either way, what you're eating today already kind of sucks, and it hasn't even had a chance to rot yet. Because here's the thing, almost everything spoiled in medieval times. Fast. You open the wooden lid of your food chest, and that damp smell hits you first. The bread's hard and damp. The cheese has a weird fuzz on it. And that meat you salted last week, well, it might be fine. Or it might be quietly planning your internal downfall. Refrigeration wasn't even a dream. Ice that was a seasonal luxury, not a household tool. And even if you could keep your food in a cool cellar, it wasn't enough. The air was damp, the vermin were persistent, and the food itself wasn't exactly top quality to begin with. So you had to get creative. People smoked food, dried it, pickled it, and drowned it in salt. And I don't mean a sprinkle. I mean meat so heavily salted it turned into a stiff pink brick. To eat it, you had to soak it in water for hours, sometimes days, to soften it up and leach out enough salt that it didn't dry out your tongue on contact. Even then, it still tasted like cured boot. And dairy. Oh boy. Milk went sour almost instantly. So instead, people turned it into cheese as fast as they could. But not nice cheese. Not the kind with flowery names and tiny French flags stuck in them. No. We're talking clumpy, chalky, aggressively aromatic cheese that lived just this side of edible. And if you were really desperate, you scraped off the mold and hoped for the best. Historians still debate whether people back then were more tolerant to spoiled food or just suffered in silence. Because here's the truth, food poisoning wasn't a rare event. It was routine. You eat something a bit off, you get cramps, maybe some vomiting, maybe you don't wake up. People didn't have a clear understanding of bacteria or contamination. So you didn't know why your stew made you sick, you just knew that Aunt Marjorie died last week, after eating oysters in July, and everyone quietly decided oysters were cursed. But you couldn't afford to waste anything. Nothing. That lump of meat with a gray spot, cut the spot off and eat the rest. Bread with mold. Scrape it, toast it, dunk it in broth, pretend it's flavor. If a chicken died on its own, you didn't bury it. You cooked it and hoped it died of old age, not some slow feathered plague. And rats. Oh, the rats. They were everywhere. If you stored your food in a sack, a rat would chew through it. If you put it on a shelf, rats would climb to it. If you put it in a box, rats would nest inside it. There were entire careers based on chasing vermin. Some towns even had rat-catching competitions. Think of it like an early form of pest control, with gambling. Here's an odd fact: people used to believe certain herbs could ward off rot, like stuffing rosemary or lavender around meat or hanging garlic over the door. It didn't work, obviously, but it smelled better than spoiled goat. Now let's say you're a baker. You knead the dough, shape your loaves, and leave them to rise, assuming your yeast hasn't died or your flour hasn't gone wormy. Then you bake. And if your bread turns out okay, you don't keep it on a nice clean rack. You store it wherever you can, under a cloth in a chest, or just dangling from the rafters in a net. And still, within days, it's stale. Within a week, it's home to things with legs. So what do? Toast it, fry it, boil it, cover it in broth, or feed it to your pig and eat the pig later. But hey, here's where it gets funny. The noble classes had the same problem. Yes, they had bigger kitchens, bigger pantries, and more cooks. But their food went bad, too. In fact, their problem was even worse because they expected food to travel. Imagine a feast where the fish arrives in a wagon from 30 miles away, bouncing in the sun for 2 days, no ice in sight. Now imagine being the guest of honor and trying not to vomit while eating royal pike pie. Spoiled food didn't discriminate. The rich might eat more of it and in fancier bowls, but they got sick just as often. Food safety was not a class privilege, it was a gamble for everyone. So people started to associate spoilage with evil spirits. Rancid butter must be cursed. Bad milk. The cows possessed. And guess what the solution was? Not better hygiene. Nope, just prayers. And maybe throwing salt over your shoulder for luck. Let's not forget the smells. The overwhelming, assaulting, nose-burning smells. Open-air markets reeked. Fish, blood guts, sweat, rotting fruit, it all mixed into a medieval perfume you couldn't wash off. People walked through them daily, bartering for a half-rotten apple and pretending it was a good deal. And let's say your stew doesn't make you sick. Hooray. Now you've got to eat it fast, because if you leave it out overnight, it's a bacteria rave by morning. So you reheat it again and again and again. Until the onions have vanished, the meat is more string than substance, and it all tastes like fireplace ash. Joke time, okay. What did one medieval cook say to the other? Is this mutton fresh-ish? It only walked off once. Look, you had to laugh or you'd cry, or die. Still hungry, hope not. Because in the next part, we'll talk about the one thing medieval people truly relied on: bread. The good, the bad, and the absolutely brain-melting, hallucinogenic kind. You're up before dawn because you're hungry, and also because the rooster's been screaming since the stars were still out. You stir from your bed of straw, stretch your sore back, and shuffle toward the hearth. The fire is out again. You forgot to bank the coals, which means you'll be eating your breakfast cold or waiting an hour to get anything warm. Either way, what you're eating today already kind of sucks, and it hasn't even had a chance to rot yet. Because here's the thing, almost everything spoiled in medieval times. Fast. You open the wooden lid of your food chest, and that damp smell hits you first. The bread's hard and damp. The cheese has a weird fuzz on it. And that meat you salted last week, well, it might be fine. Or it might be quietly planning your internal downfall. Refrigeration wasn't even a dream. Ice, that was a seasonal luxury, not a household tool. And even if you could keep your food in a cool cellar, it wasn't enough. The air was damp. The vermin were persistent. And the food itself wasn't exactly top quality to begin with. So you had to get creative. People smoked food, dried it, pickled it, and drowned it in salt. And I don't mean a sprinkle. I mean meat so heavily salted it turned into a stiff pink brick. To eat it, you had to soak it in water for hours, sometimes days, to soften it up and leach out enough salt that it didn't dry out your tongue on contact. Even then, it still tasted like cured boot. And dairy. Oh boy. Milk went sour almost instantly. So instead, people turned it into cheese as fast as they could. But not nice cheese. Not the kind with flowery names and tiny French flags stuck in them. No. We're talking clumpy, chalky, aggressively aromatic cheese that lived just this side of edible. And if you were really desperate, you scraped off the mold and hoped for the best. Historians still debate whether people back then were more tolerant to spoiled food or just suffered in silence. Because here's the truth, Food poisoning wasn't a rare event. It was routine. You eat something a bit off, you get cramps, maybe some vomiting, maybe you don't wake up. People didn't have a clear understanding of bacteria or contamination. So you didn't know why your stew made you sick, you just knew that Aunt Marjorie died last week, after eating oysters in July, and everyone quietly decided oysters were cursed. But you couldn't afford to waste anything. Nothing. That lump of meat with a gray spot, cut the spot off and eat the rest. Bread with mold. Scrape it, toast it, dunk it in broth, pretend it's flavor. If a chicken died on its own, you didn't bury it. You cooked it and hoped it died of old age, not some slow feathered plague. And rats. Oh, the rats. They were everywhere. If you stored your food in a sack, a rat would chew through it. If you put it on a shelf, rats would climb to it. If you put it in a box, rats would nest inside it. There were entire careers based on chasing vermin. Some towns even had rat-catching competitions. Think of it like an early form of pest control, with gambling. Here's an odd fact: people used to believe certain herbs could ward off rot, like stuffing rosemary or lavender around meat or hanging garlic over the door. It didn't work, obviously, but it smelled better than spoiled goat. Now let's say you're a baker. You knead the dough, shape your loaves, and leave them to rise, assuming your yeast hasn't died or your flour hasn't gone wormy. Then you bake. And if your bread turns out okay, you don't keep it on a nice clean rack. You store it wherever you can, under a cloth in a chest, or just dangling from the rafters in a net. And still, within days, it's stale. Within a week, it's home to things with legs. So what do? Toast it, fry it, boil it, cover it in broth, or feed it to your pig and eat the pig later. But hey, here's where it gets funny. The noble classes had the same problem. Yes, they had bigger kitchens, bigger pantries, and more cooks. But their food went bad, too. In fact, their problem was even worse because they expected food to travel. Imagine a feast where the fish arrives in a wagon from 30 miles away, bouncing in the sun for 2 days, no ice in sight. Now imagine being the guest of honor and trying not to vomit while eating royal pike pie. Spoiled food didn't discriminate. The rich might eat more of it and in fancier bowls, but they got sick just as often. Food safety was not a class privilege, it was a gamble for everyone. So people started to associate spoilage with evil spirits. Rancid butter must be cursed. Bad milk. The cows possessed. And guess what the solution was? Not better hygiene. Nope, just prayers. And maybe throwing salt over your shoulder for luck. Let's not forget the smells. The overwhelming, assaulting, nose-burning smells. Open-air markets reeked. Fish, blood guts, sweat, rotting fruit, it all mixed into a medieval perfume you couldn't wash off. People walked through them daily, bartering for a half-rotten apple and pretending it was a good deal. And let's say your stew doesn't make you sick. Hooray. Now you've got to eat it fast, because if you leave it out overnight, it's a bacteria rave by morning. So you reheat it again and again and again, until the onions have vanished, the meat is more string than substance, and it all tastes like fireplace ash. Joke time, okay. What did one medieval cook say to the other? Is this mutton fresh-ish? It only walked off once. Look, you had to laugh or you'd cry. Or die. Still hungry, hope not. Because in the next part, we'll talk about the one thing medieval people truly relied on: bread. The good, the bad, and the absolutely brain-melting, hallucinogenic kind. You sit down to breakfast, or maybe it's lunch. Time kind of blurs when you don't have a clock, and your stomach is always empty, and someone hands you a chunk of bread. It's dense, heavy. You could injure someone with it. You take a bite, and the texture is halfway between a sponge and a roof tile. And the taste, well, it's earthy. Let's call it rustic to be polite. Bread was the absolute cornerstone of the medieval diet. If you were poor, it made up almost everything you ate. And even if you were rich, it still found its way to your table just in fluffier, less tragic forms. But for peasants like you, the bread wasn't made of fine white flour. It was usually barley rye or oat, whatever was available, whatever grew that year. And in bad years, they'd bulk it out with ground-up peas, acorns, or even tree bark. That's right, tree bark. The original gluten-free option, I guess. Now here's where things get real spooky. You might be eating your bread chewing dutifully when your vision starts to blur. Your hands tingle. You start sweating. And then the hallucinations hit. You see the sky ripple. You hear music no one else hears. Your neighbor turns into a demon, or a goat, or a demon goat. You fall to the ground, screaming, foaming, convulsing. You, my friend, have just been dosed by ergot. Ergot is a toxic fungus that grows on rye, especially in damp, cool climates. It can mimic LSD in small doses and be fatal in larger ones. And no one in the Middle Ages understood it. If someone went berserk in the village, they didn't think, ah yes, moldy rye. They thought witchcraft, or divine punishment, or possession. Entire outbreaks happened. Whole villages gripped by dancing plagues or violent fits. Historians still debate whether ergotism explains many of these so-called supernatural epidemics. Were these people cursed or just deeply tragically poisoned by their daily bread? They even had a name for it. St. Anthony's fire. It burned from the inside, turned limbs black, and sometimes led to gangrene. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones had to wait while their flesh rotted. But let's assume your bread isn't laced with medieval LSD. It's still not winning any baking competitions. Grinding the flour was a laborious process, usually done by hand or at the local mill, if your lord allowed it. And that flour, it was coarse, full of grit, actual stone grit from the millstones which wore down over time. So with every bite you were slowly grinding down your own teeth. By age 30, your molars were probably half gone. Still, people loved their bread. Not because it tasted good, but because it was reliable, filling, easy to carry, and it lasted longer than most other food unless it got moldy, of course. Here's an odd fact: medieval households didn't throw out stale bread. They made trencher plates, thick slabs of hard bread used as edible dishes. You'd ladle stew into it, eat the food, then maybe gnaw on the trencher if you were feeling brave. Or more likely, give it to the poor, or the dogs, or toss it to the rats who were basically unofficial house guests. Nobles had their own version of this. Their bread was soft white and refined, called manchette. It was made from fine wheat flour, a symbol of wealth. But again, this was no croissant. Even the finest bread of the age wouldn't meet the standards of a modern sandwich loaf. Now let's talk about superstition. Bread was sacred, literally. People crossed their loaves before baking them. They'd never cut bread upside down. Dropping a loaf, omen of death. Giving bread to a stranger, a holy act. Sharing your last crust, Saint Level generosity. But you couldn't just bake whenever you wanted. Lords controlled the mills, controlled the ovens. Sometimes you had to pay to use the communal oven, even if it was just to bake the dough you mixed yourself. If you tried to bake on your own and got caught, fines. or worse. Because food control wasn't just economic, it was power. Joke break. What do you call bread that makes you see dragons? Pained a hallucination. Okay, it's not accurate French, but give me some medieval leeway. Let's not forget famine. In years of crop failure, often due to floods, drought, or war, there was no bread. People resorted to chewing bark, boiling grass, and baking famine loaves made of straw and mashed weeds. Not healthy, not safe, not even really food. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was one of the worst. It rained and rained and rained. Crops failed across Europe. Fields turned to mud. Granaries emptied. People starved. Some turned to cannibalism. Others sold their children for food. Bread became a fantasy, something only remembered in stories. And yet, bread endured. Through ergot outbreaks, dental destruction, and the crushing weight of feudal taxation, bread remained the anchor of the medieval meal, even when it turned on you. So tonight, as you lay back on your pillow, think about your kitchen, your clean counters, your toaster, your sourdough starter with a name, and maybe say a little thank you that your bread doesn't send you into a psychedelic medieval fever dream. In the next part, though, don't reach for that glass of water, because drinking from the well might be the fastest way to meet your ancestors. So you've managed to choke down your bread gritty dents and hopefully ergot-free. You're parched. You reach for a drink. But wait. Stop. Think very carefully. Because in medieval Europe, drinking water was one of the most dangerous things you could do. You see that well out behind your hut, the one surrounded by chickens, kids, and maybe a goat that doesn't belong to anyone. That water is not safe. In fact, it might be worse than nothing at all. Because while it looks clear, it's got surprises, bacteria, animal droppings, and the occasional frog corpse bobbing cheerfully at the surface. And the streams don't even ask. By the time water flowed into your village, it had already passed through several other villages, each with their own creative additions, latrine runoff, rotting meat scraps, and medieval industries like leather tanning that dumped everything downstream. This wasn't spring-fed artisanal glacier water. This was fluid roulette. So instead, what do? You drink beer. No, not party beer. Not Friday night after work beer. Medieval beer was weak, what they called small beer. It had just enough alcohol to kill off bacteria, but not enough to make you see double before noon. Even children drank it. Even nuns drank it. Beer was literally safer than water. And if you couldn't afford beer, maybe wine. Thin, sour, acidic wine, often watered down ironically to stretch it further even if the water added back a bit of danger. At least the alcohol gave you a fighting chance. Here's a weird fact: people didn't drink water for fun. It was only consumed when there were no other options, and usually only by the truly desperate, the truly poor, or the very, very unlucky. This wasn't about taste. It was about survival. Boiling water to purify it was known, but it wasn't routine. Firewood was precious, and boiling took time. People didn't have kettles lined up. You might boil your stew, but you weren't going to waste a fire just to make water drinkable. Still, there were some natural springs that people trusted. Sacred wells, miracle fountains, often near churches or shrines. Pilgrims would travel for days to sip from these blessed waters, hoping they wouldn't just quench thirst, but cure ailments too. Of course, these places got crowded, and when large groups of unwashed medieval humans gathered, guess what followed? That's right, disease. Historians still debate whether people knew water was dangerous or whether they just found beer more satisfying and built a culture around it. But the records are clear: wherever possible, water was avoided. And when people did drink it, they might add herbs, vinegar, or spices to mask the taste and the risk. Let's talk about monastic brewing. Monks were the true beer nerds of the Middle Ages. They refined brewing techniques, added flavor with hops, and created stronger, tastier batches. While peasants drank watery barley water, monks sipped smooth, complex ales. It's probably the only place where being cloistered with 40 other men actually improved your beverage options. Also, alewives. That's right. Women dominated the beer industry for centuries. Brewing was a household task, like baking bread or darning socks. Every cottage had its own brew. Women would sell ale from their front doors, marked by a broomstick hanging above the entry. And some of them got good at it. So good, in fact, that it became a threat. As commercial brewing grew, women were slowly pushed out. Some even believe the image of the witch with a cauldron started as anti-brewster propaganda. Joke time. What did the medieval man say after his first cup of small beer? "That's not bad, how's the second one taste?" "I don't know. I drank it and died." Now, to be fair, beer had its own problems. If it wasn't stored properly, it could spoil. If the fermentation went wrong, it could make you sick. If you drank too much, well, welcome to the village idiot tier. But still, it beat dysentery. Of course, if you were lucky enough to be a noble, your drinks were a little more exotic. Imported wines from southern Europe spiced mead, mulled cider. They poured wine through herbs and spices, not just for taste, but as a kind of medieval purification. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, rare and expensive, but believed to kill bad humors. But just like with bread, quantity didn't mean safety. Records show kings and queens falling ill from tainted wine, banquets ending in mass vomiting. And in one particularly gruesome case, a noble's wine barrel was found to contain a drowned rat, and no one noticed until it was empty. And then there were the weird drinks. Ever heard of posset? It's milk curdled with wine or ale served hot, or mead with floating herbs, or vinegar mixed with water and called a health tonic. Imagine finishing a long day in the fields and rewarding yourself with a warm cup of sour, cheesy wine milk. Cheers. And tea, coffee, forget it. Those wouldn't arrive in Europe for centuries. No caffeine for you. You want energy, eat some raw onion and hope for adrenaline. Still, people managed. They adjusted their taste buds. They drank what they could. They toasted to health and survival. And when things went wrong, when their guts turned inside out, or they spent 3 days feverish on the floor, they blamed the stars, the saints, or the cook. Never the well. Tonight, as you sip your filtered ice-cold water or your chamomile tea, take a moment. Think of all the people who wished they could do the same but instead had to choose between mild intoxication or explosive regret. In the next part, we're diving into why salt wasn't just a flavor. It was your only shot at having meat that didn't murder you from the inside out. You've managed to eat your gritty bread, avoided tripping on your hallucinations, and washed it all down with something not water. Congrats. Now it's time to get some protein. Maybe a little meat, a little sustenance, a little, "Oh no, what's that smell?" That, my friend, is salted meat. Or more accurately, meat that has been aggressively mummified in so much salt, it might legally qualify as a mineral. Because in the Middle Ages, salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was survival. Let's get this out of the way. Fresh meat didn't stay fresh. There were no fridges, no ice boxes, and unless it was the middle of winter, A fresh animal carcass would start turning sketchy within hours. So what did they do? They salted the living daylight out of it. You'd rub salt into every crevice, every joint, every bone. You'd pack it in barrels and let it sit for weeks, months, even longer. Salt pulled out the moisture along with most of the flavor and joy, and created a sort of cured zombie version of the meat it once was. Before cooking, you had to soak it, rinse it, sometimes boil it multiple times just to make it edible. The texture rubbery, the flavor salt, just salt. If you were lucky, maybe a faint memory of pig, or goat, or something that once had legs. But salt wasn't cheap. It was a prized commodity. Wars were fought over salt routes. Cities grew rich by controlling salt pans. Some workers were literally paid in salt. That's where the word salary comes from. Your access to salt determined whether you ate something vaguely recognizable or gnawed on moldy roots and regret. And here's where it gets weird. Fish was the main salted meat, especially cod and herring. Fish were caught in absurd quantities, gutted on the shore, packed in barrels of salt, and shipped inland to feed the meatless masses, especially during church-mandated fast days. That's right, there were rules. A lot of rules. The church banned meat on Fridays during Lent, Advent, and on the eves of certain holy days. That could mean up to half the year was meatless unless you were rich, sneaky, or creative. So fish became the holy loophole. Even questionable fish. Even fish that, to quote one monk, tasted like dung and sorrow. Let's say you're not near the coast. How do you get your fish? By the time it reaches your village, it's been sitting in salt for weeks. It's stiff gray and emits a smell so powerful it could clear a banquet hall. You soak it overnight, boil it, maybe toss in a leek if you've got one, and then you eat it with your eyes closed. Historians still debate how widespread good-quality salted fish actually was. Some argue that towns had access to fresh deliveries. Others say most peasants were stuck with subpar slop. Either way, let's just say your medieval sushi dreams are not happening. Here's a fun oddity: beaver tails were considered fish. Why? Because they were scaly and lived in water, so the church decided they could be eaten on fast days. Same with barnacle geese, which people believed were born out of driftwood. Yes, that was the logic. If it touched water, it might be holy enough to eat. Now, if you were a noble, your salt game was strong. You had salt cellars at the table, fancy ones filled with imported white salt from the Mediterranean. You sprinkled it on everything, not just for flavor, but as a status symbol. In fact, where you sat at the banquet relative to the salt cellar mattered. Above the salt, you were important. Below the salt, you're basically a decorative chair. But even nobles couldn't escape bad preservation. There are records of royal banquets where the meat had to be so heavily spiced, salted, or sauced, not for flair, but because it was already halfway gone. One cook literally described meat as growing weary, which is medieval code for this might already be walking itself to the grave. Joke break. What do you call meat that's been salted for so long it no longer remembers its own name? Amnesia. Okay, not bad, but not as salty as the meat. Now let's talk about the salt mines. Places like Salzburg, literally salt fortress, or the mines in Poland were treasure troves. But they were also dangerous, grueling, and full of forced labor. Getting salt meant mining deep underground, chipping away in the dark, and risking collapse. So every sprinkle of salt on your stew came at a cost, usually someone else's back. As for the average villager, you might get salt once a month. Maybe less. Maybe only when you butchered a pig. You'd try to preserve every part, the ears, feet, organs, fat, and salt, whatever you couldn't eat right away. Even the fat, called lard, was rendered and stored, used to cook, or just eaten straight during famine. Here's another weird trick: people used honey to preserve meat. It wasn't common, it was expensive, but it worked. You'd coat meat in honey and store it in sealed containers. When opened, it wasn't exactly delicious, but at least it hadn't become a petri dish of medieval nightmares. Still, the taste was always an issue. Food wasn't about enjoyment. It was about survival. Every bite was functional. Every meal was a negotiation between salt, rot, and risk. And so as you sit by the fire tonight, chewing a piece of boiled pork that tastes like seawater and disappointment, remember this: salt kept people alive, but it also defined how bleak and how utterly flavorless life could be. In the next part, we'll pull back the velvet curtain and take a look at the rich, how they ate what they ate and why even they couldn't escape the dental destruction of their sugary, spice-drenched banquets. You're not a peasant anymore, at least not for tonight. Imagine you've somehow charmed your way into the great hall of a medieval nobleman. Maybe you saved a knight's life, or maybe you're just dreaming hard. Either way, you're in, and dinner is being served. At first, it's glorious. Candles flickering, goblets clinking, tapestries fluttering slightly in the smoky air. The long wooden table groans under the weight of glistening meats, steaming pies, and colorful sauces. You think you've made it to medieval food heaven. Then you take a bite, and you realize something: rich people food sucked too, just in a different, more expensive way. Let's start with sugar. If you were wealthy, you had access to imported sugar. Not the white powdered kind. We're talking raw, gritty, brownish clumps. And you used it on everything. Meat sugar it, fish sugar, eggs sugar. There was this belief that the best food was sweet, spicy, and looked like something it wasn't. So dinner often became a kind of edible hallucination. Imagine eating a pie that looks like a swan, but is filled with minced eel and raisins, or roasted pork made to look like a hedgehog, or peacock served with its feathers reattached, dipped in gold leaf, its beak dyed crimson for drama. That's not a joke. They literally gilded food. And here's the thing: gold doesn't taste like anything. You're just eating it because you can. But it wasn't just about flavor. It was about status. The more absurd the dish, the more powerful the host. Nobody came to a feast to be nourished. They came to be impressed, and hopefully not poisoned. Odd historical fact: at one infamous banquet, they served a castle made of sugar, complete with tiny edible knights and a drawbridge that collapsed when someone poked it with a spoon. Sounds fun, right? Until you remember that each teaspoon of sugar was basically the cost of a farmhand's weekly wages. And speaking of teeth, rich people had it worse. Why? Because of all that sugar. The peasants may have been gnawing on rock bread, but at least they weren't mainlining candied pine nuts and fruit soaked in honey every day. By their 30s, many nobles had rotten teeth abscesses and perpetual bad breath. Some accounts even describe teeth blackened completely by decay, yet still considered charming because it meant you could afford sweets. Historians still debate how much sugar the medieval elite actually consumed, but the banquet records don't lie. Sugar sculptures, candied violets, rose petal preserves. Dessert wasn't a course, it was a flex. Let's talk spices. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, saffron, so exotic, so valuable. They were literally kept under lock and key. In some noble households, spices were counted like coins. A kitchen servant caught stealing even a pinch of saffron might lose a hand. And they didn't just use a dash. Oh no. Medieval recipes called for fistfuls of spices. It was believed that layering flavor showed refinement and health. You weren't seasoning for taste, you were seasoning to shout. I'm rich enough to drown this chicken in cinnamon, but it didn't always make food better. You ever tried garlic and ginger and cloves and sugar and vinegar in the same stew? No, that's because you're sane. And here's where things take a turn for the absurd false dishes. Medieval chefs loved trickery. You'd be served meatballs made of fish or a fruit pie that oozed liver. They stuffed animals inside other animals. There's a record of 24 blackbirds baked into a pie, yes, just like the nursery rhyme, and the pie sang when opened. This was seen as peak culinary entertainment. Joke break. Why did the noble stop eating his gold-covered duck? Because he couldn't stomach his investment portfolio. Now let's not forget utensils. You noble guest have a knife. Just one. Maybe a spoon. But forks rare. You used your fingers. Or your bread. That's right, rich or poor, you still wiped up your gravy with a chunk of trencher bread. Everyone around you is licking grease from their fingers, and no one's heard of napkins yet. Cleanliness, that's what your tunic is for. Also, drinking vessels were often shared. You're sipping that sweet wine from the same cup as Sir Ralph, who hasn't bathed since the last crusade. Cheers, still the show goes on. Minstrels play. A jester tumbles, someone reads a poem, and the food keeps coming, course after course after course. You don't get a menu. You just keep eating until you hate yourself. And yet, despite all the opulence, the food was often cold. Kitchens were far from the hall, and servants had to sprint through stone corridors to deliver dishes. By the time your gilded goose arrives, it's lukewarm at best, and someone's finger has probably been in the sauce. Also, no leftovers. At least not for the lords. Anything uneaten was scraped off and handed down to the household staff, the poor, or the dogs. Sometimes all three. This food was never meant to last. It was made to dazzle, not to digest. Still, nobles ate better than peasants. They had variety. They had meat. They had wine. But they also had gout, and indigestion, and dental nightmares. So maybe, just maybe, your peasant pottage wasn't so bad after all. As you drift off tonight, golden duck in one hand, toothache in the other, remember this: no matter how much money you had, good food in the Middle Ages was mostly a myth. In the next part, we'll talk about how fasting wasn't just spiritual, it was mandatory. And often it turned mealtime into a theological loophole marathon. You wake up hungry again. Surprise. But today's different. Today is a fast day, and not the intermittent kind your modern fitness friend won't stop talking about. This is mandatory, religious, unavoidable, and it happens a lot. You shuffle to the hearth hoping for a bowl of pottage or a slice of bread with a smear of animal fat. But no, today you're fasting, which means no meat, no dairy, no eggs, and if it's Lent, no joy. But here's the catch: you're still allowed to eat. You're just not allowed to enjoy it. The church calendar in medieval Europe was packed with fasting days. Fridays, Wednesdays, Lent, Advent, Ember Days, Rogation Days, random Saints' Eves, and more. Altogether, that's up to half the year spent abstaining from certain foods. And people weren't happy about it. They got creative. So what could you eat? Mostly fish. But not the good kind. Not fresh trout or grilled salmon with lemon and dill. We're talking dried, salted, possibly rehydrated cod that smells like it died twice. Sometimes it did. But the church said fish didn't count as meat because it swam. That was the logic. So fish it is, unless you couldn't afford fish. Then you ate turnips, and cabbage, and beans, and porridge. Again. Here's an odd fact: beavers were considered fish. Yes, the furry dam-building mammals. The church reasoned that since beavers lived in water and had scaly tails, they could be eaten during fasts. You're welcome. And it didn't stop there. Barnacle geese, a kind of migratory bird, were also deemed edible during fasts because people genuinely believed they hatched from driftwood. No egg-laying, no nests. Just, look, it grew on a log. That counts. Historians still debate whether medieval people truly believed these animal origin myths, or if it was just a very clever and very hungry case of spiritual loopholing. But hey, if you were rich, you weren't going to suffer quietly. Nobles paid their chefs to make fast-day meals that still felt like feasts. There were almond milk cheeses, fish molded to look like roast beef, and pastries stuffed with fruit and spiced eel to trick the tongue. You could fast and still be fancy if you had the gold. Meanwhile, back in the village, you're boiling cabbage. Again. You might add some herbs if they're growing, or some onions if last season's batch hasn't turned to mush. Maybe even a handful of peas if the rats didn't get to them first. You pour it all into a wooden bowl and eat it with a carved spoon that's seen more winters than you have birthdays. Let's talk about Lent. 40 days plus Sundays of abstaining from meat, eggs, and dairy. That meant no butter, no milk, no cheese. But if you lived in Northern Europe, that's basically your whole diet. People got desperate. In some regions, they petitioned the Pope for butter permits, a kind of indulgence that let you eat dairy during Lent for a small fee. That's right. Pay a little extra, and God's okay with your grilled cheese. There's even a cathedral in Germany, the Butter Tower of Rouen, allegedly financed through butter fines during Lent. Imagine that. A building paid for by lactose-related sin. And no, there was no cheat day. If you were caught breaking fast, it was a big deal. You could be fined, publicly shamed, forced to do penance. One record shows a man made to crawl around the town square for eating bacon during Lent. Was it worth it? Probably. But here's the flip side. Fasting brought communities together. Everyone followed the same rules, ate the same bad stew, complained about the same dry fish. There was something oddly comforting in the shared misery. And when the fast ended, oh boy, feasting. Not just food you're looking at, music, dancing, meat piled high, and enough wine to forget how much cabbage you just suffered through. These weren't just meals, they were events, a release valve for months of restraint. Joke break. What do you call a monk who sneaks bacon during Lent? A Porcratic oath breaker. Okay, maybe too niche. But trust me, Brother Gregory wouldn't laugh either. There were also exceptions. Pregnant women, the elderly, the sick, they sometimes got a pass. But most people, nope. You fasted, even if you were already half-starved. Because fasting wasn't just about food. It was about control, obedience, sacrifice. And let's be honest, it helped the church manage the population's limited food supply. You didn't just fast with your stomach. You fasted with your soul. Still, people found workarounds, pious hacks. A monk might eat after midnight and call it the next day. A noble might eat capons stuffed with fish paste and claim it tasted like Lent. Others would just look the other way because if everyone's starving, sometimes mercy is more important than rules. So tonight, as you nibble your evening snack or wonder what's for breakfast, remember this. In the medieval world, food was sacred. It was regulated, ritualized, and deeply tied to faith. But that didn't make it tastier. It just made it harder. In the next part, we're going to spice things up literally. You'll find out why spices weren't just for cooking, but for flexing wealth, masking rot, and maybe, just maybe, keeping demons away. You're in the kitchen again. The hearth is hot. The pot is bubbling. The air smells sharp. Is that cloves? Cinnamon? Wait. Is that saffron? Are you dreaming? Nope. You're experiencing the power of spices, but don't get excited. These aren't here to make your stew delicious. They're here to shout at your guests, I am wealthy, and I can afford to burn money inside my meat pie. In medieval Europe, spices were everything. They were rare, expensive, and totally irrational by today's standards. You'd find people putting pepper in wine, ginger, in fish, and cinnamon in literally everything. It wasn't because they were obsessed with bold flavor. It was because spices were status. To have a kitchen that smelled like cloves and nutmeg was to tell the world, look at me. I have trade connections, a fat purse, and enough disposable income to ruin a perfectly good roast with cardamom. But where did these spices come from? From very far away. Think India, the Middle East, North Africa, even the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia. The journey to get them was so treacherous, so long, and so heavily taxed that by the time a clove made it to your stew, it had been worth more than its weight in gold. Yes, you read that right. A handful of pepper could literally buy you a cow. And that wasn't lost on medieval people. Spices weren't kept in the pantry. They were kept in locked boxes, often guarded by the lady of the house herself. A tiny mistake, like spilling a few grains of saffron, could ruin a servant's life. Here's an odd fact: people used spices to cover up spoiled meat. That's not a myth. If your goose had been sitting out a day too long, drowning it in cumin and vinegar might trick guests into thinking it was just well-aged, or distract them long enough for dinner to be over. Historians still debate how much of spice use was about taste versus social signaling. Some argue people genuinely loved spicy, strange flavors. Others think it was all an edible power play, a way to make sure everyone at the table knew who was footing the very spicy bill. And it wasn't just savory dishes. Spices were added to desserts, drinks, even medicine. If you were sick, the physician might prescribe warm wine with cinnamon or nutmeg with honey. Did it help? Not really. But it smelled amazing. Of course, you couldn't just walk into a medieval market and grab a spice rack. Spices passed through layers of merchants, Arab traders, Venetian middlemen, French shippers, each marking up the price. By the time it got to your table, one clove might have crossed 4,000 miles and 12 languages. Now imagine you're a peasant. You don't even know what nutmeg is. Maybe you've heard about it in church stories or songs. Maybe once the lord of the manor let his workers lick the edge of a cinnamon-dusted fig tart. That was your year. But if you were a cook in a noble household, oh, you knew how to use spices. You had to. Medieval cookbooks, like the Form of Curie, were full of spice-heavy recipes with charming instructions like, take good meat, seethe it, and cast thereon powder douce and saffron to color it yellow. Vague, yes. Delicious, dubious. Expensive, absolutely. Let's break down a typical spiced dish. Say you're making blank mang, a famous medieval white stew. It's made from boiled chicken, almond milk, sugar, rice, and spices. Lots of spices. Think cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. It looks like pudding. It tastes like dinner confused itself with dessert. and it was served to kings. Here's a joke. Why did the noble bury his money in peppercorns? Because he wanted his assets well seasoned. Thank you, I'll be here all fast day. But it wasn't just food. Spices played into religious beliefs too. People thought certain spices could ward off illness, evil spirits, or even bad smells, especially important when bathing was infrequent. You might hang cloves around your neck or sprinkle cinnamon on your clothes. Think of it as the medieval version of Axe body spray, but more flammable. And spice smells were linked to the divine. Incense in churches. That was frankincense and myrrh. Holy spices. If your feast smelled like the altar, you weren't just rich, you were blessed. Oddly enough, the obsession with spices shaped entire world histories. The search for better spice routes led to the age of exploration. Columbus. He was trying to find India for pepper. Vasco da Gama, same thing. Spices helped kickstart colonialism, empires, and global trade. All because some lord couldn't stand the idea of unflavored lamb. Even wars were fought over spice-producing islands. And yet, for all that effort, most of the dishes they ended up in still bland. Or weird. Or both. Because no matter how much saffron you throw at rotten beef, it's still rotten beef. Still, the rich kept pouring it on. Puddings, pies, sausages, soups. There was no spice too strong, no flavor too chaotic. It was a culinary fever dream where balance was a word for accountants, not chefs. So tonight, as you curl up with a snack seasoned with just the right amount of salt and pepper, remember that your pantry, your boring, unassuming spice cabinet, used to be more valuable than a medieval dowry. And that once upon a time you could get stabbed over cinnamon. In the next part, things are going to get a little smoky. We're diving into the chaos of medieval cooking, how food was prepared, why half of it was burnt, and how kitchens were one wrong move away from becoming actual death traps. You're hungry again, what's new, so you shuffle into the kitchen, hoping for a bite of something that isn't salted to death or boiled beyond reason. You push open the heavy wooden door and immediately smoke. Thick, eye-watering, greasy smoke. It's in your nose, in your throat, in your soul. Welcome to the medieval kitchen, a place where fire is king, chaos is queen, and burnt is just a flavor profile. Cooking in the Middle Ages wasn't just difficult. It was dangerous. You had open flames, unstable pots, no timers, no thermostats, no ventilation. You cooked over a fire that was too hot or not hot enough. You stirred bubbling stews with sticks the size of broom handles, and you didn't wear oven mitts. You used your sleeves or your courage. Let's be clear, even the most basic cooking task, boiling water, was a gamble. You had to keep the fire going with wood or dried animal dung, adjust the pot height using metal hooks or stacked stones, and hope the wind didn't blow smoke directly into your only working eye. And your kitchen wasn't separate from your house. For peasants, it was the house. You cooked, slept, stored tools, and kept animals in the same space. So if something caught fire, which happened a lot, everything went up with it. Entire villages burned because someone's porridge overflowed. The medieval world had no fire departments, just neighbors with buckets and a prayer. Here's an odd fact: medieval recipes rarely had exact instructions. No 350 degrees for 20 minutes. No measurements. Just lines like, take good meat, boil well, add strong powder, serve hot. Who wrote these recipes? Chefs, wizards, agents of chaos. Historians still debate whether these cookbooks were meant for real use or just as status symbols. Look, how many spices I could use. Even the pots were tricky. If you were lucky, you had a heavy iron cauldron or a clay pot suspended over the fire. But clay cracked, iron rusted, and the tripod holding it all up might wobble just enough to drop your only dinner into the coals. Oops. But okay, let's say you make it past the fire and boiling water. You still had to prepare the food, which means gutting animals, plucking feathers, scraping scales, and grinding ingredients by hand. Grinding wasn't done with your blender, it was done with a mortar and pestle the size of a cannonball. And it took forever. Also, no refrigeration, remember. So if you were prepping meat, you had to move fast. Flies moved faster. The smell of blood guts and smoke was constant. You couldn't wash your hands with soap because there wasn't any. You wiped your hands on your apron or your pants, or let's be honest, the dog. And cutting boards, plates, counters, not really a thing. You chopped stuff on wood stone or directly into the pot. Hygiene wasn't just an afterthought, it was a never thought. Joke break. Why don't medieval chefs use recipes? Because eyeballing it is tradition, and so is tetanus. Okay, back to your fire pit of doom. In noble kitchens, things weren't much better. Sure, they had more space, more servants, and fancier tools. But they also had more pressure. You had to cook feasts, huge ones, under extreme time limits for powerful people who could literally execute you for messing up the roast swan. The kitchens of big estates were filled with shouting sweat and the constant clang of ladles hitting pots. Some castles had entire separate buildings just for cooking, because the danger of burning the main house down was so high. You'd have runners carrying dishes hundreds of feet across stone corridors, hoping the gravy didn't freeze or spill or get tasted by a curious guard. Spoiler, it always got tasted. Here's another oddity. Some cooks were disabled from years of burns. Scars from grease splatter, lost fingers from chopping accidents, burns from boiling broth. There were no hospitals. No burn creams. You got injured, you wrapped it in linen, and got back to stirring. And if you were roasting meat, you'd need a spit boy, usually a child whose entire job was to sit near the fire and turn a massive roasting spit for hours. The job was hot, boring, and dangerous. You could fall asleep and get whipped, or roasted yourself. Oh, and remember, there was no lighting except the fire itself. So if you were cooking after sunset, it was all flickering shadows and guesswork. You'd squint into a pot of mystery meat and hope it was done because someone said it smelled ready. People tried to get creative. They made ovens by building domes of clay and heating them with coals. But these ovens cracked, or smoked, or exploded. So most people stuck with boiling, stewing, and occasionally frying in fat. Frying, by the way, was extremely dangerous and often ended with someone setting their tunic ablaze. And then there was food poisoning. Since food was often halfway spoiled before it hit, the pot cooking was damage control. You weren't enhancing flavor, you were trying to kill the evil spirits in your mutton before it killed you. Still, people managed. Somehow, they developed techniques, added onions to mask bad smells, stirred clockwise to avoid bad luck, threw bread crusts in the pot for thickness, but also because that was dinner. They adapted. So tonight, when you turn on your stove, crack open a recipe app and preheat your oven to 375 degrees with a confident little beep. Take a moment. Appreciate your fireproof counters, your temperature dials, your light bulbs, and your food that doesn't burst into flames if you walk away for 5 seconds. Because in the Middle Ages, the kitchen was a battlefield, and every meal was hard won. In the next part, we're digging deeper into the medieval obsession with fermentation, why everything was sour, what counted as safe, and how food rot became an entire culinary lifestyle. You lift the lid on a ceramic jar. Something bubbles inside. It smells sharp, vinegary, maybe even a little fruity if you squint your nose. Whatever it is, it's alive, or used to be. Or maybe it's just fermented because in the medieval world, if it could rot, it could also be food. Welcome to the kitchen corner, where everything is sour, smelly, and surprisingly useful. Fermentation wasn't just a technique in the Middle Ages, it was a necessity, a survival strategy, and sometimes a full-blown art form. If your idea of art involves cabbage and thyme, let's get one thing straight: nothing kept. Meat spoiled, milk curdled, vegetables wilted. So fermentation became the answer to a question nobody asked, but everybody had to live with. How do I keep this edible longer than a day without it killing me? And thus came soured milk, pickled vegetables, fermented fish, beer ale, sourdough bread, cider mead, and all kinds of things that modern food bloggers now call gut-friendly, but back then were just called Wednesday's dinner. Let's start with bread. If you wanted it to rise, you had two options: yeast from the air, a mysterious magical thing, or a sourdough starter, a living blob of fermenting flour and water that you guarded like a family pet. No starter, no bread. Too warm, it dies. Too cold, it sleeps. Too neglected, it turns evil and smells like regret. That yeasty blob might be passed down through generations, whispered about like a spell. This was great-great-grandmother's starter, before it turned green and tried to climb out of the bowl. Next up, beer and ale. We talked before about how beer was safer than water, but it wasn't just the drinking that mattered. Brewing was a way of preserving grain. You couldn't store barley forever, but you could turn it into something fizzy and mildly intoxicating. Ale was brewed in homes, taverns, monasteries, anywhere with a bucket and a dream. The process was deeply tied to daily life and often to women. The alewives ran the show, selling beer from their doors, wearing tall hats and stirring cauldrons. Yes, that image. Sound familiar? Historians still debate whether alewives influenced the later imagery of witches. Pointy hats. Check. Big bubbling pots. Check. A cat named Gertie who sits by the fire while you ferment barley. Absolutely. Then there was mead, the drink of honey and water left to ferment into something sweet and strong. Mead was popular among the wealthier classes, but even peasants made crude versions when honey was available. It had a romantic image: poets drank it, warriors toasted with it, monks brewed it with herbs and spices, but sometimes it was just sour bee soup and milk. Oh boy, milk lasted about 6 minutes, so you curdled it on purpose. You made cheese butter and buttermilk, each a form of fermentation or preservation. Cheese, in particular, was essential. Hard cheeses could last for months. Soft cheeses, well, less so unless you liked your lunch to smell like damp laundry. Here's an odd fact: fermented fish was considered a delicacy in some places. Scandinavians buried it. Others just pickled it in brine and prayed. You open a jar and it hits you in the soul. The kind of scent you can feel in your molars. If you've ever heard modern-day surstrumming, you know what I'm talking about. Now imagine that, but in summer in a hut with no windows. Even vegetables weren't safe. People made early versions of sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, sometimes stored in pits or buried in clay pots. It was crunchy, sour, and packed with vitamins. And it probably saved lives in winter when fresh greens were a distant memory. And yet no one really knew what fermentation was. They just knew it worked. Bread rose, beer fizzed, cheese hardened, wine turned sharp. They called it spirit's alchemy, God's blessing. Or if it went wrong, the devil's rot. Joke time. What did the medieval villager say when his ale exploded? Well, guess it's possessed again. Pour me another. Fermented foods weren't just practical, they were cultural. Whole communities had fermentation rituals. Specific cheeses came from specific valleys. Certain beers were linked to monasteries or feasts. Even the way you stirred your cabbage could be passed down like a family heirloom. And yes, things went wrong. Starters died. Jars cracked. Batches spoiled. You might take a sip of cider and immediately regret your life choices. But when it worked, fermented food was magic, nutritious, long-lasting, and sometimes even delicious. Modern science now tells us fermentation was crucial for gut health, immunity, and nutrition. But back then, people just thought it was lucky. If your sourdough rose or your cheese didn't kill the cat, you lit a candle for St. Bridget and hoped the good streak held. Still, there was always risk. One bad batch could lead to bloating, vomiting, or something worse. And if you didn't know the difference between fermented and rotten, you found out the hard way. So tonight, if you've got a fridge full of yogurt, kefir, kombucha, or pickles, maybe give it a little nod. Because for your medieval ancestors, fermentation wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was the line between eating and starving. In the next part, we're heading back to the banquet table to compare the lavish waste of the elite with the scrap-scraping survival of peasants and why even leftovers were a matter of class. The feast is over. The roast peacock has been demolished. The pie that bled eels is now just a buttery crust. The spiced wine has been spilled, toasted, and sloshed into every noble goblet. You lean back, dizzied by the sensory overload, your fingers sticky with honey and confusion. But then you look around and something hits you. There are mountains of food left over, and no one seems to care, because in a medieval noble household, waste was luxury. If you were rich, leaving food uneaten wasn't just allowed, it was expected. It was a flex, a power move. It told your guests, we have so much that we don't need to finish. We can throw away enough beef to feed a village and still sleep easy. And that's exactly what they did. Food scraps, crusts, bits of meat, chunks of bread, fruit, rinds, it all piled up. Sometimes it went to the dogs, sometimes to the poor, sometimes straight into a ditch behind the kitchen where it sat in the sun and told flies their work was not yet done. Meanwhile, a mile away, or maybe just a few feet, peasants were licking wooden bowls clean, praying the rats didn't get to their last onion. Leftovers, what leftovers? The difference between feast and famine was not just luck, it was class. Even the food itself reflected this divide. Rich dishes were layered with spices, sugar, and symbolism. Poor meals were functional. No one cared what pottage meant. They just wanted it to stop their stomach from eating itself. And if you were lucky enough to get scraps from the Lord's table, they weren't always edible. Bread trenchers soaked in greasy sauce, bones with nothing left on them, fish heads. Sometimes they'd toss it out to the poor as alms, a word that sounds generous, until you realize it was often just an excuse to get rid of trash without having to look at it. Here's an odd fact: some nobles employed food tasters to check for poison before they ate because being rich meant you had enemies, so a servant would take a bite of your roast duck. If they lived, dig in. If they keeled over, order something else. And while nobles were tossing half a boar into the moat, peasants were getting jailed for stealing a turnip. Yes, that actually happened. Food theft wasn't petty, it was criminal. In one recorded case, a man was whipped for taking a cabbage from a monastery garden. In another, a child was locked in the stocks for filching an egg. You see, in a world where food holds power, even a carrot was political. Historians still debate how often the poor got access to noble scraps. Some lords were generous, distributing leftovers through the church or public feasts. Others couldn't be bothered. It depended on the region, the season, and the mood of the person sitting in the big chair. And of course, if food was being rationed during famine, plague, or war, those at the bottom were the first to go without. Lords stockpiled, peasants starved. That was the system. Joke break. Why did the peasant bring a sack to the noble's banquet? Because he knew the real meal started after everyone left. Badumts. Let's also talk about banquet planning. These weren't just meals, they were theatrical performances. Lords would order way more food than necessary, not because they were hungry, but because feeding 50 with enough for 500 made them look powerful. They'd arrange exotic animals, build edible sculptures, and commission elaborate sugar castles just to smash them down and feed none of it to the staff. Contrast that with the peasant family, who spent hours stretching a single cabbage over 3 meals, boiling it, reboiling it, and calling it soup, because technically, water counts as a second ingredient. This wasn't just about preference. It was designed inequality. The food gap reminded everyone where they stood. Even the act of eating reinforced class nobles had servants to cut their meat, to refill their goblets, to taste their food. Peasants ate with their hands in silence, grateful for gruel. And what about when food got old? If a noble's meat smelled funny, toss it. If a peasant's bread turned moldy, scrape it. If it had bugs, pick them out. Hunger taught you not to be squeamish. You didn't throw out food because it was ugly. You threw it out when it made you collapse. Some peasants even invented their own luxuries. They'd flavor their gruel with wild herbs, make thin onion broths, bake flatbreads on stones. Not because it tasted great, but because it felt like variety, and they shared. In small communities, food was communal. Neighbors lent flour. Mothers bartered eggs for wood. When someone had a pig to slaughter, everyone showed up not just to help, but to receive a share. Poor people knew they couldn't afford waste, so they didn't. One more odd fact: bones weren't waste, they were ingredients. Boiled once for broth, then again for soup, then chewed or cracked for marrow. Nothing was wasted. Even stale bread was reborn as crumbs, thickeners, or food for livestock. So tonight, as you put your leftovers in the fridge, maybe in a nice container, you'll microwave later. Remember, in medieval times, leftovers were a privilege. One class had too much, the other had too little. And the scrap between them could mean life or death. In the next part, we'll follow that imbalance even further to the butcher's block, where animals died fast, inspection didn't exist, and disease was just part of the flavor. You're walking into the village square. It's morning, the sun is barely up, and the air is already thick with the smell of blood hay and something vaguely metallic. You follow the scent to a low wooden stall, where a man in a leather apron is swinging a cleaver that's seen far too much. Welcome to the Butcher's Block Medieval Edition. And let's get this straight right away. This is not a sanitized USDA-approved operation. There are no white coats, no gloves, no cold storage, no inspections. If it walks, squawks, or squeals and looks even vaguely edible, it gets chopped. Meat was precious, scarce. But when you did get it, especially as a peasant, you didn't ask questions. You just hoped it wouldn't kill you. Now imagine you're that butcher. You don't work in a clean, tiled room. You work in an open stall or under a tarp surrounded by flies, dogs, and curious children. You slaughter animals on site, often right next to where people are shopping. Blood runs in the street. Organs are tossed into buckets. The head, you might display that on a spike to show freshness. And what animals? Whatever's available. Cows, pigs, chickens, goats, rabbits if you're lucky. Cats and dogs if you're really unlucky. If you lived near a coast or river fish. If you lived near a forest and were daring poached game which could get you killed, but hey, at least you'd die full. And disease, let's just say, nobody checked. If a pig dropped dead, you could still sell it. Maybe it died of a fever. Maybe it ate poison. Maybe it just gave up. Didn't matter. You butchered it, salted it, and moved on. Meat was meat. And desperate people didn't get picky. Historians still debate whether this widespread use of questionable meat contributed to certain illnesses. But back then, nobody knew what salmonella was. They just knew that sometimes you ate stew and didn't wake up. Or you spent the next 3 days with the flux, which is a poetic medieval way of saying explosive disaster. And then there's how they butchered. Without refrigeration, everything had to move fast. You'd kill in the morning, butcher by noon, sell by evening. What didn't get sold, either preserved, salted, smoked, or buried in lard or tossed. But tossed often meant just thrown into the gutter or river. So yes, the water you were drinking last chapter probably had a pig spleen floating in it upstream. Joke break. Why didn't the medieval butcher ever tell jokes? Because his delivery was always too raw. Not bad. Not worse than the meat. Now rich people had their own butchers, private ones, usually attached to the castle kitchens. These men were better trained, had cleaner tools, and often handled more exotic animals, peacocks, swans, even bears in some cases. But even they worked fast and loose. Clean cuts were a luxury. You want a filet mignon? Too bad. You're getting chunk of leg with mystery bits. One odd fact here. Entire animals were cooked with the fur or feathers on, especially if they were being roasted whole. The hair was burned off later, so your dinner might still smell a bit barnyard. And waste. There wasn't any. Every part of the animal was used. Blood for sausages, intestines for casings, hooves for glue, bones for broth. Brains, livers, lungs eaten. Eyes, maybe not in the stew, but someone somewhere tried them. The peasants got the scraps. Often they had to wait until after the Lord's share had been taken, sometimes days later. By then, the meat might be turning, so they'd boil it again, add onions and pray. And if you had no money, no animal you scavenged, you waited for accidents. Animals hit by carts or who died mysteriously. There are records of people fighting over a dead dog in the road, skinning it, and cooking it before the Lord's bailiffs arrived. And of course, there were butchers who cheated. You'd buy beef, but it was goat. Or buy goose, and it was duck stuffed with pig fat. Some even soaked bad meat in vinegar or wine to hide the smell. The medieval equivalent of Febreze for your chop. This led to laws, very inconsistent ones. Some towns tried to regulate butchers' mandatory market days, bans on selling sick animals, limits on prices. But enforcement was spotty and corruption was rampant. Plus, if you fined every butcher for selling gross meat, nobody would be left. People even held public meat inspections, not for health, but for fairness. Was it weighed properly? Was the butcher cutting short, but nobody had a microscope? If the meat was twitching protein, let's talk about offal, the nasty bits. In today's world, it's trendy again. Bone marrow toast, liver pâté, But back then, it was life. The poor were given the organs because nobles found them gross. Jokes on them organ meats have more nutrients than most muscle cuts. So while the noble was gnawing on a dry hunk of boar, the peasant was getting iron vitamin A and something vaguely chewy. Still, the risk was always there. You didn't know what diseases the animal had. No vet had cleared it. And if you didn't cook it thoroughly well, hope you've got a lot of garlic and a forgiving God. So tonight, when you cut into a clean pink, neatly trimmed, inspected piece of meat, take a moment. It's not just dinner. It's modern science, sanitation, and supply chains that your ancestors would have traded their only cow for. Because in medieval times, meat was survival risk and status, and every bite came with a side of danger. In the next part, we'll explore the myth of the vegan peasant, why plant-based diets weren't a trend. They were a punishment, and how even vegetables had their own set of problems. You're sitting in a smoky, dirt-floored hut again, stomach grumbling. No meat today, not because you're fasting, not because you're a fan of the plant-based lifestyle, but because you simply don't have any. The pig is gone. The chickens stolen last month. The last time you saw cheese, it was in your dreams. So what's on the menu? Cabbage, again. You've probably heard the modern myth that medieval peasants were basically vegans chomping on wholesome grains, foraging wild greens, sipping brothy soups by candlelight like rustic monks. Sounds peaceful, right? Yeah, that's a romanticized lie. The truth, peasants weren't vegan by choice. They were just too poor for meat. Meat was expensive, rare, and usually reserved for the upper classes or feast days. If you got a bit of bacon or some lard to stir into your gruel, you celebrated. But most days, you were eating what your small plot of land or the forest could offer. And that meant vegetables. Lots of them. But not the heirloom rainbow carrots or perfectly trimmed kale you see on Instagram. Think turnips with bugs, leeks with rot, beans with weevils, onions that have been almost sprouting for 3 months straight. Still, you made it work. You chopped, you boiled, you hoped, and you kept your expectations low. Let's talk about pottage. This was the go-to dish for nearly every meal. A never-ending stew of whatever you had: barley peas, cabbage, garlic, herbs, wild greens, and maybe if you struck gold, a bone. You kept it simmering for days, adding to it constantly. It aged like wine, but in reverse. Here's an odd fact: some families called their pottage by names like Thursday stew or the old one because it never truly started or ended. You just added new things to the old things until the pot eventually said no more. It wasn't all bad. Vegetables were hearty and your body needed them. Beans gave you protein. Cabbage gave you fiber, but also gas. So much gas. Peasant homes probably sounded like slow bubbling kettles all day long. And let's be honest, vegetables weren't exactly safe either. If you didn't wash them right, or didn't have clean water to wash them with, you were in for a rough evening. Dirt, bacteria, parasites, it wasn't glamorous. People even died from poorly prepared beans, which contain natural toxins unless cooked properly. Still, you worked with what you had. You grew leeks, which were cheap and easy. Onions for flavor. Garlic, if you were lucky. Parsnips, beets, spinach, peas, and barley all made appearances. Fruits were rarer, especially fresh ones. You might dry apples or plums, but sugar was too expensive to preserve things sweetly. Historians still debate how often peasants had access to fresh produce year-round. Without refrigeration, most vegetables were seasonal, so winter was lean. You relied on dried legumes, stored roots, and whatever didn't rot in the cellar. Joke time. Why didn't the medieval peasant eat salad? because he couldn't afford raw disappointment. Let's also clear something up. While the nobleman's plate overflowed with meat and spice, he still ate vegetables. They just had to be dressed up. Carrots glazed in honey, turnips baked in almond milk. Fancy processed and usually cooked to oblivion crunch. Not in this castle. Meanwhile, peasants were doing the opposite, getting every last calorie from whatever plant passed for edible. They foraged, too, gathering wild herbs like nettles, dandelions, sorrel, and mustard greens. These were nutritious and everywhere. But it took knowledge. You had to know what wouldn't kill you. Get it wrong, and that salad became a hallucination. Still, the line between plant-based and barely surviving was thin. You didn't eat vegetables to cleanse. You ate them because you had no cow, no pig, and no options. Let's not forget grains, the other pillar of peasant eating. Oats, rye, barley, and sometimes millet. You'd make gruel, which is like porridge's sadder, thinner cousin. It was hot, bland, and filling. Sometimes you sweetened it with a piece of fruit, sometimes with nothing. But it filled you up. Ish. And yes, on feast days when the church allowed and fortune smiled, you might have eggs, cheese, or a scrap of meat. But those were the exception, not the rule. Interestingly, the church loved to glorify the peasant diet, praising the purity of plain food. Humble meals, they said, brought you closer to God. Easy for them to say when they were eating salted fish behind the monastery walls with imported wine, and peasants wanted meat. Desperately. If you stole a rabbit from the Lord's woods, it wasn't because you were tired of lentils. It was because you hadn't had real protein in a month, and you were starting to eye the neighbor's dog. And what about famine years, when the harvest failed and vegetables disappeared too? That's when things got bleak. People ate grass leaves, bark. Some baked bread from ground-up acorns and moss. Others scavenged in compost heaps. There are records of people chewing old leather just to keep their jaws busy. No one romanticized the peasant diet then. Only now do we look back and pretend they were doing rustic wellness retreats. So tonight, if you're crunching into a carrot or biting into a bright green salad with vinaigrette and goat cheese crumbles, remember this: plants were once the food of desperation, not delight. In the next part, we'll see how all of this meat-vegetables scraps fasting was flipped upside down when the Black Death arrived. And suddenly nobody had to worry about dinner because dinner was dead. You wake up one morning and something feels off. The village is quieter than usual. The air is still, like it's holding its breath. No carts clattering, no chickens arguing. You step outside and see a door left open across the lane. No smoke from the chimney. No dog barking. You walk over, push the door, and realize they're all inside. Still. Cold. The Black Death has arrived, and with it food doesn't just suck, now it disappears. The plague swept through Europe in waves beginning in the late 1340s, wiping out somewhere between 30 to 60% of the population, depending on the region. That's every third person you know gone. Your neighbor gone. The baker gone. The woman who sold you beans and insults gone. And when people go, so do the systems that feed them. Farms are abandoned. Markets collapse. Food rots in the fields because there's no one left to harvest it. Animals wander untended. Oxen break from plows and graze in churchyards. Grain stores are raided, then ignored, then infected with rats and mold. Entire food chains, literal and economic, break down in days. But here's the weird part: for a lucky few who survive the first wave, life gets better. Why? Because now there's more food than people, fewer mouths, more fields. Suddenly peasants are eating meat again, fresh bread, wine even. There are accounts of villagers upgrading their diets simply because their lords were dead and their grain tax no longer existed. Historians still debate whether this post-plague improvement in diet was widespread or exaggerated in hindsight. But records show that for a time ordinary people ate more and better. Cattle herds recovered, wages rose, hunting restrictions loosened, and the food that had once been aspirational for peasants became attainable at least briefly, but not without cost. Food may have been available, but getting it was terrifying. Towns closed their gates, villages posted armed guards, travelers were turned away, suspected of carrying the plague. Even food sellers were attacked, blamed for spreading infection through contaminated goods. And let's not sugarcoat the conditions. Imagine trying to buy bread from a man who's coughing blood into his apron, or getting a ham from someone whose entire household died last night. You wouldn't feel hungry, you'd feel haunted. Joke break. All right, but it's grim. Why did the baker stop delivering during the Black Death? Because business was dropping, like flies. Too soon, maybe always. Here's an odd fact: many people turned to spiritual fasting in response to the plague. They believed the disease was divine punishment, so they stopped eating in repentance. Entire towns organized processions of starving penitents walking barefoot through mud, praying and fasting together. They were hungry, terrified, and desperate to appease whatever higher power they thought was furious at them. Others went the opposite direction. They feasted wildly, drank themselves into oblivion. Eat, drink, and be merry, they said, for tomorrow we die. This wasn't a metaphor, it was a daily reality. The plague didn't just kill people, it reshaped the food economy. With so many dead land became available, peasants began negotiating for better conditions, less grain tax, more grazing rights, even cash wages. Lords desperate for workers agreed. This was the first crack in the feudal system, and food was at the center of it. Suddenly people had choice. If the lord next door offered more grain and less labor, you moved. That was unthinkable before the plague. Now it was survival strategy, and with fewer people to feed, meals improved temporarily. Diets grew more diverse. There was more access to eggs, milk, and bread, even fish, but not for everyone. In cities, the story was worse. Trade broke down. Imported goods, spices, sugar, dried fruit vanished. Prices for basics soared. Riots broke out. Bread lines formed. The rich hunkered down with stockpiles. The poor starved or looted or begged. Even among survivors, fear changed how food was prepared and shared. Communal ovens went unused. Shared bowls became individual portions. People stopped eating in public. Feasts were canceled. Religious festivals, often marked by huge shared meals, disappeared. And let's talk about death carts. You might be eating a crust of bread while watching one roll by. Bells ringing, a man shouting, "Bring out your dead," and suddenly that stale crust doesn't seem so comforting anymore. In some places, fields of wheat went unharvested because there were no farmers. Records tell of people walking through golden grain that no one had the strength or courage to cut, yet somehow life went on. Eventually, as the plague burned out in each town, food systems limped back into motion. Fields were cleared, bread was baked again, ale brewed, animals raised. But the memory lingered. A generation grew up with trauma baked into every meal. Food no longer just symbolized class, it symbolized survival. So tonight, as you make your dinner in peace and quiet, free of death bells and dread, remember this. The worst food in the world still beats food you're too afraid to eat. And sometimes just having food at all was the greatest blessing of the medieval world. In the next part, we'll step inside the bare-bones kitchens of peasant families, where tools were scarce, recipes didn't exist, and dinner was built on instinct and inherited guesswork. You're back in your hut. The fire is low. There's no pantry, just a few baskets, a shelf with some shriveled onions, and a clay pot that always smells vaguely of old cabbage. This is the heart of your home, your kitchen, if you can even call it that. In the medieval world, kitchens weren't rooms, they were corners, spaces, fire pits, sometimes nothing more than a flat rock and a stick. And for most people, cooking wasn't a creative hobby or a nightly event. It was a daily test of survival. Let's take inventory of your tools. You have one pot, one wooden spoon, maybe a knife, but it's as dull as your last prayer, a ladle carved from a branch, a flat stone for baking if you're lucky, and a cloth that's been cleaned mostly by shaking it outside. No forks, no pans, no thermometers, no cutting boards. Your oven is a hole in the ground, or a clay dome that smokes out the neighbor's goat every time you use it. Historians still debate how standardized cooking spaces were across regions. But one thing's clear for most peasants, kitchen setup was whatever you could build, steal, or inherit. You cook over an open flame trying to avoid burning your hair. You stir with your dominant hand and use the other to swat smoke from your eyes. There's no chimney. The air inside is black with soot. Your walls are stained. Your lungs probably too. You don't measure ingredients. You don't even have ingredients. You just know the handful of things your family grows or trades. Recipes. Those are oral, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, laced with sayings like, add herbs until the pot smiles or stir until it smells right. Precision wasn't part of the plan. Odd fact. Some peasant women would place a pebble in their cooking pot to rattle around and help stir the contents evenly. You'd better hope no one forgets and bites into it. And what are you making tonight? Let's say gruel. Again, you add water to oats or barley. Maybe toss in chopped greens. If you're lucky, a sliver of bacon or a spoon of drippings from last week's roast. You stir slowly, not because it's delicate, but because the spoon is warped and your arm is tired. Occasionally you bake. You press dough flat, slap it onto a stone and angle it toward the fire. If it burns, you scrape it. If it's raw, you eat around it. If it catches fire entirely, well, crispy edges were fashionable once. And you serve food the same way every time in a shared bowl. One pot, one spoon, passed around. The adults eat first, then the kids, then the baby. If anything's left, it goes to the pig, or the dog, or gets saved in the pot for tomorrow, becoming the base of a new dish that is frankly the same dish. Let's not forget cleaning. You scrape the pot with hay, maybe sand. You rinse it with water from the bucket you pulled from the communal well earlier, the one that tasted faintly of frog. Soap, that's for the nobility or the church. Here's a joke. Why did the peasant never open a cookbook? Because his kitchen only had 2 steps: boil it, pray. Now there were special cooking events. Feast days, weddings, harvest festivals. For these neighbors might gather to help cook in a larger hearth or even dig a communal fire pit. Bread would be baked in shared ovens, meat roasted on shared spits. You'd bring your own spoon, though. Always bring your own spoon. Some wealthier peasants might build detached kitchens, a small structure outside the home, especially in fire-prone areas. But for most, cooking remained part of the living space, open, messy, smoky, and dangerously close to flammable thatch. And still people cooked. Every day. Even when the food was the same. Even when it didn't taste like much. Even when it took hours to make something that vanished in 5 bites. Because food wasn't just nourishment. It was ritual. Routine. A connection to family. You stirred the same pot your mother stirred. You used the same stone. You chopped with the same knife that had fed 5 generations. Sometimes the only flavor in your food was memory. And if someone passed by while you were cooking, you offered a bite. It was bad luck not to. Guests, especially traveling clergy, might show up unannounced, and it was considered a sin to send them away hungry, even if it meant splitting your meal 4 ways instead of 3. Still, food envy was real. If someone caught a rabbit and you didn't, you'd smell it roasting through the village, and you'd feel it in your stomach and your bones. Some people got creative. Clay pots with multiple chambers, hanging cauldrons, suspended grills made from old tools, but nothing was consistent. Your cooking setup was a reflection of your life held together by luck, hope, and a little smoke damage. So tonight, as you preheat your oven to an exact degree and set a timer to the second, remember this: you are living in luxury. Your kitchen is a temple of miracles. Your dishwasher, a medieval fantasy. Your refrigerator, literal sorcery. Because once upon a time, dinner didn't come with instructions or recipes or guarantees. It came with a fire, a spoon, and a prayer. In the next part, we'll explore the weirdest and wildest things medieval people called food, from animal parts you didn't know were edible to the bizarre loopholes that turned fish into dessert. You're hungry. Again. But today there's no bread, no stew, no grains, no anything. You're down to your last options. And in medieval times, when you ran out of options, you started getting creative. Welcome to the weird world of, wait, you can eat that. This is the part of the menu. No one talks about the edge of the food pyramid, where hope dies and survival begins. Let's start with animal parts. In today's world, we mostly eat the good cuts, loins, ribs, thighs. But in the Middle Ages, if an animal could be skinned, cooked, and chewed, it was on the table. And not just the muscle. We're talking ears, snouts, hooves, stomachs, intestines, eyeballs, tongues, brains, and feet. The entire animal was used often out of necessity, not choice. Tripe, the lining of a cow's stomach, was a delicacy in some towns and a punishment in others. Pigs' trotters' feet were boiled until gelatinous. Cow tongue was seasoned and roasted. Brains were mixed into pies or served scrambled with herbs, and lungs were sometimes baked into blood pudding, which, if you're lucky, tasted like iron and onions. If you're not lucky, it tasted like regret. Historians still debate whether these dishes were genuinely enjoyed or simply tolerated, but they were common, especially in winter, especially for the poor. Let's talk about blood. Yes, blood. It was used in blood sausages, blood pancakes, and even blood soups. It was boiled to thicken stews, give depth to flavor, and stretch limited meat further. A fresh pig's blood was a resource no one wasted. Waste not, want not. Faint not. And then there was bone marrow scooped from cracked bones and spread on bread like butter. It was fatty, rich, and nutritious. People ate it not because it was trendy, but because it was the last edible part before the dogs got their turn. Here's an odd fact: in some coastal areas, people ate whale meat, not just muscle, but also skin and blubber. Fatty, oily, rubbery blubber. It was considered a luxury and a fast-day food. Yes, a 40-ton sea creature counted as a religious loophole. Which brings us to the weight that's fish section of the medieval cookbook. Remember those fasting days we talked about? Well, people got flexible. Animals that swam were allowed. So some very creative theologians stretched the definition of swimming to biblical proportions. Beaver tails. Definitely fish. They're scaly. They're aquatic. They slap the water. Fish. Barnacle geese born from driftwood, never seen on land, obviously seafood. Otters, swimmers. Fast day friendly. Dolphins, not only were they eaten, they were served to kings. And then there's eels. Slippery, slimy, and seemingly immortal. They were so abundant in some rivers that rent was paid in eels, literally. Here's 200 eels for the roof repair, good sir. And they were everywhere, roasted, boiled, baked in pies, stuffed in sausages, and ground into paste. People even made eel jellies. Let that sink in, eel jelly. And no, it wasn't dessert, though some medieval jellies were. Using fish bones and hooves to create gelatin, cooks made aspics that suspended chunks of meat fruit or eggs inside a shimmering cold goo cube. You sliced into it and got a surprise kind of like medieval Jell-O, but somehow more ominous. Joke break. Why don't medieval chefs play hide and seek? Because whatever they hide, they eventually eat. And then there were bugs. While not widely consumed in famine years, insects were absolutely eaten. Beetles, grubs, worms. If it wriggled and didn't fight back too hard, it could be mashed into a paste or roasted over coals. Not ideal, but not lethal either, usually. Let's not forget bread substitutes. During famine, people made bread from ground-up bark acorns or even dried ferns. These weren't nutritious. They were just fillers, edible-ish materials to trick your stomach into thinking it had food. Also on the desperation list, glue. Made from hooves and bones, it was sometimes boiled and flavored when people had absolutely nothing. There are accounts of children eating it off shoes, or furniture chewing it, like medieval jerky. But not everything was gross. Some of it was just strange. Like hedgehogs, which were skinned, gutted, and roasted whole, sometimes wrapped in clay, which peeled off with the spines when cooked. Or rooks, a type of bird stewed with apples. Or swans, which were so tough that they were usually just for show and never actually eaten. That didn't stop nobles from trying. And if you were a traveling pilgrim or soldier, you might rely on hardtack, a kind of bread so dry and dense it made modern crackers feel like cake. You could eat it, but only if you soaked it in broth, or wine, or your tears. Yet through all this weirdness, people survived. They adapted, they shared, they experimented. They passed down recipes for things that by modern standards would be unthinkable. And sometimes they even liked it. So tonight, as you nibble your lightly salted kale chips and sip your carbonated water, infused with natural essence, remember you have options. You have refrigeration. You don't have to make eel jelly. Because back then the phrase, "what's for dinner," was less a question and more a cry of uncertainty and occasionally desperation. In the next part, we'll dive into the divine politics of food, how the church controlled what people ate when they ate it, and how sin, sacrifice, and supper were all tangled together. You're sitting down to eat again, yes, but before you take that first bite, you cross yourself, murmur a prayer, and hesitate. Not because the food looks bad, though, let's be honest, it probably does, but because in the medieval world, eating wasn't just about hunger. It was about holiness. Food was not merely nourishment. It was a spiritual matter wrapped tightly in rules, rituals, and religious meaning. What you ate when you ate it, how you prepared it. All of it was watched over not just by your Lord or your family, but by the church. From fast days to feast days, from dietary restrictions to divine justifications for gluttony, the medieval table was a place where God met your stomach and often told it no. Let's begin with the calendar. The liturgical year was filled with holy days and saints' days, each carrying its own culinary code. As mentioned earlier, nearly half the year was made up of fasting periods, some strict, some symbolic. But these weren't optional. They were religious law, and breaking them wasn't just socially frowned upon, it was a sin. You didn't eat meat on Fridays. You avoided dairy during Lent. You skipped rich foods before major feasts. If you slipped, you confessed. Or depending on the place and period, paid a fine, performed penance, or earned a public scolding from the pulpit. Odd fact, in some towns, butchers and bakers were banned from working on fast days, not just to enforce the rules, but to keep temptation out of sight. No sizzling pork, no buttery pies, just the holy aroma of boiled turnips and quiet judgment. But it wasn't just about what you ate, it was about why. The church taught that food was a test of discipline. Overeating wasn't just bad manners, it was gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins. Eating too well, a sign of vanity. Eating too fast, a lack of self-control. But here's where it gets complicated. The church also loved food. Feast days, especially major ones like Christmas and Easter, were full-blown religious celebrations. Monks baked elaborate breads. Priests blessed entire roasted oxen. Cathedrals laid out tables groaning with pies, fish, and wine. It was holy excess, a reminder of God's generosity. Right after a month of fasting and cabbage stew. And the monasteries, oh the monasteries. You might think monks ate like hermits, plain and pure. But some monasteries were gastronomic fortresses with kitchens bigger than chapels. Monks brewed beer, cured hams, invented cheese recipes, and developed entire manuals on how to cook for the glory of God. Some had 3 meals a day while technically fasting by getting creative with loopholes. Historians still debate just how strict monastic fasting really was. In many places, rules were bent, reinterpreted, or politely ignored, especially when patrons or bishops came to visit. That's when the no-meat rule mysteriously included beaver, dolphin, and even swan. As long as the animal was near water, apparently its soul was more fish than flesh. Joke break. Why did the monk bless the roast chicken? Because he was hoping God wouldn't notice the wings. But outside the cloistered walls, food and faith were often about control. The church enforced its food laws, not just for piety, but for power. Regulating food meant regulating behavior. It kept communities synchronized, obedient, and humble. You knew what day it was by what was on your plate. Lent wasn't a season, it was a diet plan from the heavens. And sermons made sure you didn't forget it. Priests preached against gluttony and drunkenness, warning that overfilled bellies led to sin. Paintings in churches depicted demons force-feeding the damned, shoving food into their mouths until they choked in hellfire. On the flip side, saints and holy figures often fasted to extremes. Some ate only herbs, some lived on communion wafers. One woman claimed to survive for years on nothing but the Eucharist. Whether or not it was true, the message was clear: food was worldly, and heaven required you to let go of your earthly appetite. Still, people got hungry, and hungry people get clever. That's where alms came in, giving food to the poor, was considered a holy act. Leftover bread, old stew, dried fish all counted as charity. Wealthy families gave food to beggars as a form of spiritual insurance, a little meat now to save your soul later. And when harvests were good, blessing the fields was a common practice. Priests would walk through crops, swinging incense and muttering prayers to ensure a fertile season. Food and faith were woven into each other. Every loaf of bread came with a prayer, a superstition, or both. Even in the home, food rituals persisted. You prayed before meals. You might cross your loaf of bread before cutting it. If you dropped food, you whispered apologies. And if you shared your meal with a stranger, it was said you were feeding Christ in disguise. But food wasn't just about your soul. It was about social order. Fasting was harder for the poor, yet they were held to the same standard. In theory, everyone was equal before God. In practice, some were just hungrier. Wealthier folks found loopholes. Peasants found empty bowls. Yet the rules applied equally, at least on paper. So tonight, as you scroll through your recipe app and pick what you want to eat, remember that for centuries, someone else made that decision for you. Your cravings didn't matter. Your beliefs did. Your diet wasn't about taste. It was about obedience. In the next part, we'll delve into the gross, grimy, often hilarious world of medieval food safety, or lack thereof, and why your dinner table was always one spoiled turnip away from disaster. You're about to eat. The pot's been bubbling for hours. You stir it. Smells okay. Kind of. Maybe a little sour, maybe a little too sour. You hesitate. But you're starving, so you eat it anyway. And then you wait. And wait. For what exactly? For your stomach to betray you. Welcome to medieval food safety, or more accurately, the total absence of it. In a world without refrigeration, sanitization, or food inspectors, every meal was a gamble. You didn't just eat to survive, you ate and hoped to survive. Because sometimes your stew was fine, and sometimes your stew decided to become a biohazard. Let's start with storage. There weren't any plastic containers or vacuum seals. If you had leftovers, rare, but it happened, they were stored in clay pots, linen sacks, or wooden boxes. These were tucked into cool corners of your hut or buried in the ground in root cellars. Sometimes they were hung from the rafters to keep rats out. Did that work? No. Rats climbed. They gnawed through sacks. They nested inside barrels. If they didn't steal your food, they contaminated it. And flies everywhere. The phrase fly-blown meat wasn't just descriptive. It was a common experience. If you left a chunk of meat out, it was covered within hours. Eggs, larvae, little wriggling signs that dinner was about to become a horror story. Here's an odd fact: people often used cloth soaked in vinegar or wine to cover food. Not for flavor, for protection. They hoped the acidity would kill bacteria, though they didn't have a word for bacteria. They just knew food sometimes made you die, and sometimes didn't, and vinegar felt like a magic shield. Historians still debate how aware medieval people were of the causes of foodborne illness. They didn't know about microbes, but they did know patterns. They noticed that certain foods made people sick more often, especially meat and dairy. Which is probably why many peasants leaned on grains, even if they didn't exactly love them. Then there was spoilage detection, medieval style. There were no expiration dates, so you relied on smell. If it knocked you back, bad sign. Color green or gray equals suspicious. Texture if it squished when it shouldn't, avoid. And bravery: if no one else wanted it, you might get it for free. And still, people ate spoiled food. because they had to. They couldn't afford to throw it out. That hunk of cheese with blue veins cut around it. That bread with mold, scrape it. That pig with a strange rash when it died, salt it and pray. And don't even get started on milk. Fresh milk spoiled within hours. You could try to make cheese or butter, but both had to be done quickly and cleanly, which was not a guarantee. Ever had sour milk on purpose? That's medieval yogurt. Ever had it by accident? That's medieval stomach roulette. Joke time. Why didn't the peasant complain about his soup being spoiled? Because it was better than last week's, which was moving. Okay, maybe gross, but accurate. Even water could turn on you. You know this. Wells were easily contaminated by dead animals, latrine runoff, and careless neighbors. Towns tried to enforce rules about where you could dump waste, but enforcement was spotty. One man's soup could be flavored by another man's, let's say downstream decisions. Now in cities, things were worse. Markets were packed and meat sellers weren't exactly hygienic. Butchers slaughtered animals in the street. Blood flowed into gutters. Meat hung on hooks in open air, exposed to sun, insects, and dust. Bread was sometimes baked with ash in it. Flour might have insects. Dried fruit was occasionally just live fruit. To combat this, some towns introduced food ordinances. These were early regulations. Don't sell meat that smells like death. Don't water down wine. Don't dye spoiled fish with herbs and pretend it's fresh. Great rules barely followed. One record from London in the 14th century describes vendors selling rotting poultry, black of wing and green of belly. The punishment, confiscation. Not much of a deterrent. And it wasn't just the ingredients. Cooking practices were inconsistent. Fires weren't precise. Pots were unsealed. You might boil stew for 3 hours or for 30 minutes. It depended on the fire, the cook, and the chaos level that day. The church tried to help, sort of. Priests warned about gluttony, but also preached moderation and cleanliness. Monasteries were often cleaner than cities, with rules about washing hands before meals and not leaving meat out too long. Monks even recorded early methods of tasting vinegar to see if it had turned bad. But let's be clear, food safety was up to you. If your food made you sick, it was probably a judgment from God, or demons, or bad luck, not poor hygiene. And when things went wrong, diarrhea, fever, vomiting, you just hoped it passed. There were no antibiotics, no IV drips, just prayer, rest, herbal teas, and possibly death. Still, people kept eating. They learned to spot the worst signs. They seasoned aggressively. Spices didn't just show off wealth. They also masked rot. They fermented, they salted, they dried, they smoked. They weren't helpless. They were inventive survivors playing defense against nature every single day. So tonight, when you open your fridge and see a sell-by date, when you toss a yogurt because it's 1 day past expiration, take a moment. Appreciate your food labels, your refrigeration, your peace of mind, because once upon a time, a bowl of stew could be both dinner and your final act. In the next part, we'll return to the upper class where banquets where excessive food was art, and indulgence wasn't just accepted. It was the point. You step into the hall, and it's like walking into another universe. The air is warm with candle smoke and roasted meat. Gold glitters, silk rustles. The floor vibrates under marching feet and music. Someone's bringing in a tray that looks like it might actually be glowing. Welcome to a medieval banquet where food isn't just sustenance, it's theater. It's ceremony. It's proof that you've made it. And if you're a noble, eating like this is your birthright. Here at the long table raised above everyone else, indulgence isn't sinful, it's strategic. The more you consume, the more you flaunt your wealth. Each roasted swan, each gilded pear, each spicy sauce says I am rich enough to eat recklessly. This is the inverse of the peasant world, where food was a tool for survival. At the banquet, food is a weapon of status. Let's walk through what's on the table. First, the layout. No single plate. You've got trenchers' discs of stale bread used as edible plates, though you probably won't eat yours. That's for the servants later. You might get a salt cellar at your place setting. If you're seated above the salt, you matter. If you're below it, you're mostly scenery. Your knife yours to bring. Forks. Still not common even at this level. Most people use fingers or spoons. You wipe your hands on your tunic or a shared towel or a dog under the table, not a joke. That was an actual strategy. Then come the courses. Not 3, not 5, try up to 20. Each one more dramatic than the last. You might start with spiced wine, then get a meat pie shaped like a castle, a roast boar's head with an apple in its mouth, a peacock feathers reattached after roasting, a sugar sculpture of a unicorn fighting a lion, both of which can be eaten technically. But should they be? That's another question. And here's an odd fact. Sometimes animals were cooked whole, then stuffed with other animals. A chicken inside a duck, inside a goose, inside a pig, inside a cow. It wasn't about flavor, it was about shock and awe. Historians still debate how often these over-the-top dishes were actually consumed versus simply displayed. But the records make one thing clear: banquets were performances. You don't just serve food, you announce it. A servant carries it in. Someone plays a trumpet. A herald describes it. Everyone cheers. It's part feast, part play, part power move. Joke break. Why did the noble only eat food shaped like castles? Because he liked to rule his portions. Now don't be fooled. Not all of it was delicious. A lot of the food at these banquets was weird by modern standards. Sauces with vinegar and sugar and onions and raisins and cinnamon all together. Meats boiled, then fried, then dyed blue with crushed flowers just for the look. In fact, color was a huge deal. Medieval cooks used ingredients like saffron spinach juice or ground-up beetles to tint their food. If your meal was purple gold or bright green, you were living large. Let's talk about dessert. You might get marchpane, an early form of marzipan, candied rose petals, or fruit preserved in honey. But mostly, dessert was more spectacle. Picture this: a jelly tower that trembles when touched, or a pie that releases live birds when cut open. Yes, that nursery rhyme is based on something real. These weren't just fun, they were metaphors. Food represented power, fertility, abundance, dominance over nature. If your banquet could confuse delight and impress guests, it served its purpose even if nobody liked the taste. And who ate all this? Not just the Lord and his family. There were hundreds of guests, courtiers, minor nobles, local clergy, knights, favored servants. Seating was hierarchical, of course. You sat according to your rank. You were served accordingly. You even got different dishes depending on your status. Behind the scenes, chaos. Dozens of cooks, spit boys, sauce makers, carvers, servers, cupbearers. Banquets required a small army and sometimes took days or weeks to prepare. And after, waste. Lots of it. Bones, rinds, crusts, and unfinished dishes were scraped into barrels or thrown out the back. Some might be given to the poor, some to the dogs, some just left to rot. Food wasn't always about feeding people, it was about displaying wealth, even if that meant throwing most of it away. Still, these banquets weren't just vanity projects. They were political tools. Inviting someone to your table showed allegiance. Seating them in a prominent spot was a gift of honor. Denying food, serving bland or cold dishes, or offering leftovers that could spark offense or worse, a feud. Food meant diplomacy. It meant alliances. It meant power. And yet even here in the glow of torchlight and glory, food could still go wrong. A spoiled roast. A bad oyster. A miscalculated spice blend. Nobles might eat better than peasants, but they weren't immune to bad cooks or bad meat. Plenty of royal stomachs turned inside out from poorly handled banquets. So tonight, as you think about excess, about all the ways food can be too much, too complicated, too absurd, remember this. The medieval noble banquet was the birth of the over-the-top dinner party. The original Michelin-starred madness. The first Instagram meal centuries before cameras existed. In the final part, we'll tie everything together and explore how the legacy of this strange, dangerous, indulgent food culture still shapes our fears, rituals, and cravings today. The fire is low. The feast is over. The fields are dark. And your stomach is finally full. Not with food, maybe, but with something else, a story, a journey, a strange, smoky memory of what it meant to eat in the medieval world. You've seen it all now. You sat beside the hearth in a peasant hut, eating barley pottage with a wooden spoon. You walked through buzzing markets and spoiled meat stalls. You gagged on salted cod, dodged ergot hallucinations, and gave thanks for cabbage when there was nothing else. You watched nobles peel gold leaf off their swan monks, sip honey mead in silence and a plague cart roll by while your bread turned to mold in your hand. You've tasted desperation, indulgence, discipline, innovation. You've seen food as survival, as status, as sin, and as celebration. You've learned that in the Middle Ages, every bite came with baggage, spiritual, political, and deeply personal. And through all of it, one truth held steady. Food sucked in medieval times. It sucked because it spoiled. It sucked because it was bland. It sucked because it was risky. It sucked because most people didn't have enough of it, and when they did, it wasn't good. But food also mattered. It brought people together. It marked the seasons, told the stories, signaled feast or famine, peace or plague. It revealed everything: who you were, where you lived, what you believed, and what you were willing to eat when there were no options left. Even the weirdest parts, the eel jellies, the barnacle geese, the spit roasted, anything inside, everything still speak to something deeply human: creativity under pressure. People made do, people adapted, people cooked even when the odds were awful. And slowly, over centuries, things got better. Markets became regulated. Cooking evolved. Preservation improved. Taste mattered. And now you have refrigeration, running water, temperature control, forks, health inspectors, a spice rack. You can choose what to eat, when, and how. You can reject food because it's too soggy, too salty, or not vibey enough for your Thursday night. And that's a privilege unimaginable to almost everyone who came before you. So as you fall asleep tonight full of this strange history, remember, you are the end result of 1,000 years of culinary struggle. You are the descendant of people who survived bad stew and worse decisions. You are proof that food doesn't have to suck anymore. But if it does, if you've ever scorched the garlic or forgotten the rice on the stove, take comfort. At least your dinner didn't try to kill you. Now let go of the feast. Let the candle gutter out. Let the ghost of the last stale loaf crumble into the dreamscape. You're safe, you're warm, and breakfast tomorrow will be delicious. Word count 100. End of script. Good night.